grapple with centuries of racial, economic, and environmental justice inequities, repression, and degradation, we also acknowledge the incredible power of nature to help us heal and better understand life. And here tonight to help us better understand nature, and specifically the mysterious and beautiful world of lichens, we are grateful to have with us Dr. Jesse Miller. Jesse is an ecologist and researcher at the confluence of community ecology, landscape ecology, and ecological restoration, with a particular interest in the effects of altered fire regimes on biodiversity. Much of his current work focuses on understanding the effects of global change on ecological communities and informing conservation management decisions. Jesse spent 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher at UC Davis studying effects of fire severity and altered fire regimes on plant and lichen communities. He completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is currently a lecturer at Stanford University. Thanks so much for being with us, Jesse.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be here, here in the virtual world with all of you. Be nice to be in person, but the plus side is I think this allows people from farther afield to join in. So anyway, yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you all about lichens and some interesting stories about how lichen communities are changing in the world around us. But I just want to start by acknowledging that it is kind of an interesting week to be doing this. When we planned this talk back in November, we didn't realize, what the state of the world would be during this week of the year. It's basically the civil rights movement of our time happening. And, for me personally and many colleagues, it's been kind of hard to focus on science this week. So I just want to start by saying Black Lives Matter and
I don't have the chat questions in here like you did. I wonder what that.
And one thing I've been thinking about this week is, doing field work. I get to run around a lot of places and look at plants and lichens, and lichenologists often look suspicious when we're just like staring at a tree very intently. And I've only had a handful of run-ins with cops in my life when I'm doing field work, and they've usually, they've always actually ended like without any major conflict. And I realize that not everyone, gets to have that privilege. So I've just been thinking about how even in the world of botany, ecology, environmental sciences, we have a lot of work to do to make it really welcoming environment that's where everyone has the same kind of opportunities. So anyway, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the situation we're in that I'm sure most people here are thinking about right now. Anyway, tonight I'm going to talk about the wonderful lichen diversity we have here in California. And I'm going to tell you a few stories about some of the research I've been working on recently, but I'll just start off with a little bit of background. And see if I can get my slides to advance here. All right, I'm having a little small technical difficulty here. One moment, please. Well, that's interesting. Oh, there we go. All right. Hope you're all hearing me still. So for anyone who's not familiar with lichens, are we good?
We are. Sounds
okay. Great. The slides weren't advancing, but we've advanced. Seems to be working. So for anyone who's not familiar with lichens are symbiotic organisms that contain at least one fungal partner and at least one photosynthesizing partner, and sometimes multiple of each of those partners potentially. and I actually gave a talk a couple weeks ago for the Santa Clara Valley chapter of CNPS, delving more into the question of what lichens are, which is actually a very interesting question. But tonight I'm going to focus on more of the big picture, looking at how lichen communities change as we move across landscapes. But the meeting from a couple of weeks ago is online, so if you'd like a more detailed definition of what lichens are and how our understanding of them has changed over time, you can find it there. For the most part, for anyone who did watch the presentation a couple weeks ago, tonight's presentation is going to be almost entirely different, talking about some different research, but a few of these slides at the beginning are the same slides, just to give a little bit of background. So one reason why I find lichens really exciting and interesting is because they're a really large component of biodiversity in a lot of terrestrial ecosystems. They come in many different colors and shapes and sizes, and I just find them incredibly fascinating. And in some ecosystems, there's actually more lichen diversity than vascular plant diversity. Like, for example, in sagebrush steppe ecosystems, you know, where you may only have 10 or 20 vascular plants in an acre, you can sometimes find 50 species of ground-dwelling soil crust lichens, these cryptic and mysterious lichens that cover the bare soil between the plants in these semi-arid regions. So that's one thing that I find interesting about lichens. But lichens are also ecologically important. They play a critical role in food webs. They provide food for a surprisingly large number of animals. And one of my favorite examples of this is Bryoria, or horsehair lichen, which is one of the primary foods of flying squirrels, which are an iconic mammal of old growth forests of Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. The flying squirrels, in turn, are an important food source for spotted owls, which are one of the most iconic species of conservation concern in the history of Western North America. I'm sure many people know the story of how the spotted owl led to major federal policy changes that protected not only old growth forests, but a lot of other specific rare organisms that live in these forests. It's not just the squirrels that eat the lichens, but many, many other animals, ranging from insects to large mammals. Caribou will travel long distances in boreal and Arctic regions to find lichens to eat. So just to summarize, the ecological importance of lichens, the way I see it is that, we have lichens as the foundation for everything cool and important in the world around us. No, I'm exaggerating. It might not be quite that simple, but for being relatively small, cryptic, difficult to see organisms, they play surprisingly important roles in ecological networks that support all kinds of different life around us. Another example is they can provide nutrients to vascular plants. And obviously, we're all fans of vascular plants here at the Native Plant Society. But here in California, we're actually in a particularly interesting part of the world for lichen diversity. And this is a map made by Aaron Tripp and James Lindemer, who are lichenologists from Colorado and New York, respectively. And this map just illustrates that lichen diversity in California is particularly outstanding compared to the rest of North America. You can see that their lichen diversity index that they created here, California is almost off the chart in terms of lichen diversity compared to the rest of North America. Here, the continent is broken up into ecoregions. And not only that, but the Bay Area is considered the epicenter of lichen diversity in North America. So we're really in a very special place when it comes to the lichen communities here. And we have a lot of opportunities to study and appreciate the wonderful lichen communities here in the Bay Area. So it really is a unique place to be when it comes to lichenology. But even though we're the Bay Area is, I would say it's safe to say, a global hotspot for lichen diversity and endemism, there's a lot we still don't know about basic lichen biodiversity patterns, and also the ecology of lichens. So why is it that, you know, certain species occur some places and not others? How is it that lichen communities change across landscapes? And, you know, another important question, how are humans affecting lichens? And what can we do to maintain the diversity of lichens that we have? And, you know, a lot of these are unanswered questions. Here in California, we have a lot of botanists. There's been, you know, just a huge amount of botanical research over recent decades, going back, you know, for over a century, actually. But we often estimate that the ratio of lichenologists to botanists is somewhere between 1 to 100 and 1 to 1,000. There just aren't a lot of people out there doing lichen research. So anyway, I hope some of you, if you're not already excited about lichens, may be inspired to join us. And, you know, the first step is just starting to notice the lichens that are all around you in your daily life, because there's a lot of important observing to be done that can help us better understand our lichens in this very interesting part of the world. But even though we have, you know, extremely diverse lichen communities here in California, there are definitely some substantial threats to lichen diversity. And I'm going to talk about some of these tonight. But what I see as some of the major threats to California lichen diversity are foremost probably habitat loss. And that's the case for, you know, almost every kind of organism. Habitat loss is the leading cause of global biodiversity loss. But in addition to that, air pollution actually has significant effects on lichens. And it's a major issue in any kind of urban or industrialized area. Another major issue we deal with, particularly here in California, but also globally, is altered fire regimes, which I'll talk more about later tonight. And of course, climate change is also potentially going to have major effects on our lichen communities, or perhaps already is having major effects on our lichen communities. So we're living here in this wonderful lichen hotspot with this incredible diversity of landscapes and ecosystems, but we're facing a lot of challenges as well. So it's an interesting time to be a lichenologist in California. This is a map of forest inventory and analysis plots across North America. And this is probably the best network of documenting lichen diversity in North America. In fact, I'd say there's nothing else even comparable. This is a program that the Forest Service has carried out for decades now, where they send crews out to survey lichen diversity using a standard protocol, you know, in the majority of states, in the 48 states. And so in this map, the study plots that have higher lichen diversity are the orange and yellow colors. So you can see that California is right up there with just a handful of other states in having very high lichen diversity on average in our study plots, particularly in the Coast Range. And this is a map that was put together by Rob Smith, who's a lichenologist in Oregon. And this was part of Rob's PhD research, where he was investigating how climate change is potentially influencing lichens in different parts of North America. And he did a study where he examined the thermal tolerance of lichen species and extrapolated that to look at the entire communities of lichens in these study plots that the FIA established to see which communities were most vulnerable to climate change potentially. So this next map shows the communities that were potentially most vulnerable to climate change as the black dots. Everything else is the light gray dots. So you can see, according to Rob's analyses, lichen communities in California are actually among the most threatened by climate change of any lichen communities in North America. You know, you can see that it's just a few other states that have these plots where it appears that the envelope, the environmental envelope in which the lichens can grow is shifting most rapidly beyond, you know, the current conditions that the lichens can tolerate. So potentially here in California, we face some serious challenges when it comes to maintaining our lichen diversity as environmental conditions are changing around us. That said, this isn't going to be an all doom and gloom story. you know, there are positives about the situation we're in right now. We certainly have more information about our lichens than we ever have before. So I hope tonight I can present some of the challenges we're facing, but also talk about, you know, some of the potential insights and innovations we can make, because there's a lot we can do to help maintain our lichen diversity and even restore lichen diversity in places where it's been degraded potentially. And
Jesse,
yeah,
there's a good question here. May I interject?
yeah, absolutely. I was just about to see if there was anything yet, actually.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was from Kelly Runyon. What's the formula for the Tripp and Lindemer diversity index?
Yeah, great question. I think they actually divided by species richness by area. So I think there actually may be some bias towards the smaller polygons in that map. Yeah, I wasn't involved in that project. So I'm going to talk to them more about that. I suspect that because species accumulate in a nonlinear manner as area increases, you know, there's like a saturating curve. So I suspect that if we adjusted for the nonlinear relationship, the California would still probably be #1, but maybe not in such a dramatic fashion. But I'm not 100% sure of that. I just kind of added that map in here at the last minute because I had remembered seeing it and thought it was super cool. Is that all for now on the questions?
It is, yeah.
And just to everyone watching, I'm happy to take questions as we go, maybe at the end of each of the little sections I do. And then for questions that are a little farther afield or more tangential, we'll have plenty of time at the end to get to any of those too, I think. So one thing that I find really fascinating about lichens is that they're acutely sensitive to the environment, and they respond to the environment around them at very fine scales. And one reason why this is interesting and useful is that it means lichens can be effective environmental indicators. They can give you a lot of information about what's going on at a given site because they respond at such fine scales, I would say both in time and in space. And one example of this is that lichens are very sensitive to air pollution. And I talked about this for Santa Clara Valley a couple of weeks ago in a lot more detail. I'm just going to mention it on this one slide tonight. But in places with relatively clean air, we can get these really extensive communities with high biomass, like this usnea draping off of tree branches on the left here. And in polluted places, we tend to get much more simplified lichen communities, just a handful of species that tolerate high pollution levels. And lichens have been used for a long time as pollution indicators. They're actually one of the best tools we have for measuring air pollution at fine scales when we want to get really high replication of sample sites. But tonight I want to focus on using lichens as indicators for a few other ecological processes. And like other organisms, lichens have differing responses to disturbance, which is one thing I want to focus. Actually, basically the rest of my talk tonight is going to focus on how lichens respond to different kinds of disturbance. So tonight I want to address 3 questions that I think are interesting and just relevant to the situation we're in California right now. So first of all, I'm curious if we can use lichens as indicators of high quality late successional habitats and habitat conservation value. Because typically when we're looking to make management decisions and decide what parts of the landscape we want to prioritize for conservation and restoration, we're interested in the potential conservation value of those habitat patches. And so I'm interested in exploring how lichens may be useful as indicators of habitat conservation value. But another big challenge we're facing in California right now is the shift towards larger, hotter wildfires, in some cases more frequent wildfires. The changes actually vary among different ecosystems, but wildfires have certainly changed in recent decades in California, and there are a lot of interesting questions about how these changes in wildfires affect biodiversity of many different organisms, but lichens in particular are something that's been very little explored. and specifically how fast do lichens recover after wildfire. It's something that we really haven't studied very much in California. So I'll be presenting some research tonight addressing all of these three questions. So I'm going to start out by talking about recent research I've been doing, looking at lichens as indicators of old growth forests. And then I'll go on to talk about briefly about two different studies I've done looking at lichens as indicators of fire history to understand how lichen communities may change and recover after wildfires. And before I dive into the research, I just want to acknowledge that all of these projects I'm going to talk about tonight are collaborative projects. I have some really wonderful collaborators, including some extremely experienced lichenologists. So I just want to thank John Villela, Ali Weil, Daphne Stone, Hugh Safford, Amanda Hardman, and Heather Root, who've all contributed to various aspects of this research I'm going to do tonight. You know, science is very rarely an individual effort, and I'm really grateful to all of my wonderful collaborators for helping make all of this possible. So one major challenge that land managers and conservation planners face is, excuse me, is recognizing the conservation value of different parcels of land. Because when a conservation organization is going to be you know, spending its budget to buy land or to choose parcels to prioritize, they want to know, you know, what the best route is, what's going to lead to the best results when it comes to maintaining biodiversity or other goals related to ecological integrity. But the concept of conservation value is kind of ambiguous. And there are a lot of different organisms out there, and it's rarely possible to go out and assess the biodiversity of many different groups of taxa, just because it takes so much expertise to really recognize biodiversity in many different groups of taxa. But in general, we know that sites that have experienced less intense anthropogenic disturbance are likely to have greater biodiversity, particularly of species of conservation concern. So one thing we can do is look for sites that have you know, older forests or older plants in general. I don't want to exclude non-forested ecosystems here, because we know that old growth grasslands, which is kind of an emerging concept in the last decade or two, old growth grasslands can also be really important old growth late successional ecosystems. But one thing I've been thinking about recently is the idea that lichens might help us recognize these sites that have exceptional conservation value. And just a quick ecological lesson here for anyone who's not familiar. The concept of ecological succession refers to change in ecological communities over time. And it's deeply tied in with the concept of disturbance. The idea is that when ecological disturbances occur, it can reset the clock on succession. And historically, ecologists viewed succession as kind of a linear trajectory where communities would approach a certain climax state, which was kind of the final result of succession. And then they would stay there until another disturbance happened. And by disturbance, I just mean anything that removes biomass, which can include you know, wildfire, grazing, logging, you know, both human-caused and non-human-caused ecological events. And the way we see succession has changed over time. We no longer see it as necessarily a linear trajectory with a fixed endpoint. The picture can be a little bit more complex in the current paradigm. We recognize that there are potentially multiple stable states that ecosystems can reach, and things don't necessarily just move in one direction. Things can move around between different states. But nonetheless, despite some shifts in the paradigm that have happened in recent decades, most ecologists would agree that late successional habitats and habitats that have been, you know, relatively undisturbed by intensive anthropogenic activities are often very important for conservation and biodiversity. And one reason for this is just because humans have intensively altered so much of the world around us that these places are relatively rare. They often harbor organisms that are slower growing, and maybe less likely to occur in places that have been more intensively modified by humans. And I just want to add that I don't see all modification by humans as a bad thing. I think humans can have very positive influences on biodiversity. So I don't want to pose it as this people are bad, nature is good paradigm. I think we're part of nature, and I think it's more complex than that. But the fact remains that a lot of humans have exploited many landscapes for industrial purposes, and the places that haven't been exploited are often special and rare, and it's important to be able to recognize them. And we've known for quite some time that vascular plants respond to these kinds of successional gradients. And there's actually a fairly widely used system for examining this with vascular plants that's very widely used in the eastern United States, and it's starting to catch on in the West. But it's still not really used in California to the best of my knowledge, although I'm interested to hear if anyone knows otherwise. But this is a system called floristic quality analysis, which calculates a variable called the coefficient of conservatism. And the basic idea behind the coefficient of conservatism is every plant species in a given region is ranked on a scale from 1 to 10. And species that receive low rankings are species that have a relatively high tolerance for anthropogenic disturbance. So they occur in what we might call early successional communities. And species that receive high rankings are what we might call specialist species that really depend upon relatively undisturbed habitats or late successional habitats. And then we have our intermediate species that, are somewhere in between or may be able to survive across the whole gradient of disturbance to some extent. And I'd actually be kind of curious to hear if many people who are here tonight are familiar with this system. In the Eastern US, everyone who's into plants is familiar with this basically. I think partly because ecosystems in the Eastern US are just so much more intensively affected by human activities. In the West, our mountains, maybe they've been logged in most places, but they're still relatively wild. So I think that may be why this hasn't caught on. But in any case, this system, which I've worked with in the past during research, inspired me to wonder if we could do something similar with lichens. And one reason why it seemed like this might be possible is because lichens can also be reliable indicators of high quality late successional habitats, like old growth forests, as the primary example. We actually have a number of lichens that occur mostly or entirely in old growth forests. One of my favorite examples is Nephroma occultum. And this is a species that lives it's in the Pacific Northwest. It doesn't quite make it into California, but I think it makes it into just the edge of the California floristic province in Southern Oregon. You'll only find it in forests that are over 100 years old, I'd say. And another species that we do find throughout Northern California is Loberia oregana. And this isn't quite as strict of an old growth forest specialist, but you still find it, for the most part, in old growth forests. It's a pretty reliable indicator of old growth forests. And there have actually been several people who've made lists of old growth indicator lichens over the years, particularly in Europe, where there's just been more lichenological research in general. So people will make lists of species they consider to be old growth forest indicators. But one issue with these lists is they're rarely tested quantitatively, and they're rarely tested over large geographic areas. So it's hard to say how useful and reliable they really are. And another limitation of this system is it's a binary system. So species are either considered indicators or not indicators. But, as modern ecologists with a sophisticated, nuanced worldview, we know that all species in a community are potentially giving us useful information. And so if we just consider species either old growth associated or not, then we may be able to do more than that. We might be able to learn more from the species about what's going on. Because we also know that some lichens are strongly associated with relatively disturbed habitats. And one example of this is the lichens that do well in places with a lot of air pollution, like the orange and yellow lichens, like xanthorias, some of the small gray lichens, like physias. These species grow in both early successional forests and in places that experience other kinds of disturbance. And then we have a lot of lichens that seem to be more like generalists, including our beautiful state lichen, Ramelinum and zizii, and the tube lichens, Hypogymnia species. That's just a couple examples of species that occur perhaps across a gradient of disturbance, but they don't seem to be strongly associated with either early successional or late successional communities necessarily. So with all this in mind, I worked with some colleagues to develop what we called the Lichen Conservation Index. And this is really directly based on the floristic quality assessment index that I was just talking about with vascular plants. And we did this for the Pacific Northwest, but I think this is also relevant to Northern California, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But what we did was we ranked all common epiphytic macrolichens in the Pacific Northwest on a scale of 1 to 10 based on what we thought their affinity for old growth forest was. And you might call the approach we took the wisdom of the crowd, because this wasn't quantitative. We ranked the species based on our own field experience. And I should say, I actually let these other 3 lichenologists do the ranking. They're probably 3 of the most experienced lichenologists in Oregon. John Villela, Daphne Stone, and Amanda Hardman. They each have somewhere around 15 to 20 years of field experience, being out half the year, hundreds of days a year surveying for lichens. So they really have a good sense about what lichens you find in what kinds of habitats. So what we ended up doing was ranking these 225 lichen species on a scale of 1 to 10 based on what we thought their affinity for old growth forests was. So these more disturbance species, tolerant species, got lower numbers. The more old growth forest associated species got higher numbers. And then we took some of the survey data from the forest inventory and analysis data set that I talked about earlier to test relationships between the age of forested stands and the lichen ranking system that we established. And so this project actually took place using data from the Cascades in Oregon and Washington, but I think it's relevant to Northern California because a lot of these same lichen species occur in Northern California because we have very similar forests, especially in the Coast Range of Northern California. So I think this same system is potentially applicable much closer to home for all of us here in the Bay Area. You can go out to Marin County and find a lot of these same lichen species growing in a conifer forest there. So what we found was on the x-axis here, we have the ranking that we gave to the lichen species. And then on the y-axis, we have the average age of the stand where the lichen occurred in the FIA data set. So what you can see is that these rankings that we based on our own field experience are pretty strongly associated with the actual age of the forest stands that from the FIA data set. So species that received low numbers like 2 and 3 tended to occur in stands that were less than 100 years old. And species that received a ranking of 10, which was our highest ranking, tended to occur in forests that were over 200 years old. And we, the next step we took was for each of these FIA study plots, we averaged the lichen rankings of all the species that occurred in each study plot, and then plotted that against stand age. So on this graph, the x-axis is stand age, and the y-axis is the average conservation index ranking for each lichen, for each study plot, averaged across all the lichen species. And you can see there's a pretty nice strong positive relationship between stand age and the conservation index ranking value. And you can see we have a few outliers that seem like they have unusually high conservation index values for their stand age. And so what I wonder is if those plots are plots that have what we might call a lot of old growth character, despite not being the oldest of stands, perhaps because they've been managed in ways that promote old growth conditions. We also compared this this continuous approach to a binary index where we just ranked species as either old growth indicators or not, which is what a lot of other people have done in the past. And you can see that you still get kind of the same result, but it's just not as strong of a pattern. You have a lot more scatter in the data. So I think the take home message here is it does seem that lichens can be good indicators of old growth forests, which is really cool to see because we can potentially go into a forest stand, do a lichen survey, you know, which can be done fairly quickly in a small stand, and perhaps have some idea about the conservation value of that stand, or at least some idea about the stand age. And I think this is also cool because it suggests that this approach that I call the wisdom of the crowd, where we learn things based on the field experience of experts, does seem to actually be meaningful. And this is cool because, you know, many experienced ecologists feel like they have this knowledge of ecosystems, but we rarely have opportunities to actually quantitatively test it based on data. So I think it's just nice to see an example that this experience that ecologists get over many years in the field can really shake out to be significant when we look at it with data. So that's everything on that first project with old growth forests. I'll go on to talk about fire history next. Do we have any other questions before we move on?
Yes, there's one question asking about community science projects addressing the questions you're proposing. You have anything going that, you know, that like iNaturalist or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of potential for that kind of thing. The challenge is just the reliability of the data with, platforms like iNaturalist, I would say. Because, I would say macro lichens, the large three-dimensional lichens are relatively easy to learn to identify, but there are some cryptic lichens that are difficult to identify, and it can be easy to make mistakes. So yeah, that's something I'd like to explore more. I think there's a lot of potential for that. The challenge is just figuring out, how to avoid look-alike species being misidentified. So yeah, I can't think of any specific examples off the top of my head, but yeah, that's something I'd like to explore more personally.
Does it help to get them to family or, or genera?
No, genus, yeah, potentially. Lichens have families, of course, just like everything, but lichen families aren't nearly as meaningful as vascular plant families. I think for one thing, they're just larger and there's more ecological variability within families. So it's not like plants where, very few lichenologists actually know off the top of their head what family every lichen is in, whereas like all botanists know what family every plant is in. Good question, though. Anything else before we move on?
Yeah, we have some questions in the Q&A section here. Are epiphytic lichens more susceptible to air pollution?
Great question. I would say, I'd say it depends more upon the morphology of the lichen than the substrate they're growing on. But the short answer would be yes, because epiphytic, you tend to get more like three-dimensional lichens on trees, like these fruticose lichens in this picture, the hair-like lichens. Whereas the lichens you get on other substrates like rocks or soil tend to be flatter and more oppressed, so they don't have as much surface area to absorb pollutants.
Okay, we also have a couple more questions. Why are lichens biologically so sensitive to pollution?
Yeah, great question. So I'd say the main reason for that is because lichens don't have roots. So, when you think about plants, they're getting a lot of their nutrients out of the soil. So they're not really as sensitive to the air around them. Whereas lichens are just, the nature of lichens is they're soaking in everything that's in the air around them. And so because they just soak in everything, they soak in the pollutants along with the nutrients that they're trying to absorb. And I think that's true for mosses as well. So lichens and mosses both are a lot more sensitive to air quality than vascular plants. So that, we would consider them to be a much more reliable indicator.
Okay, and one more here. Does the similarity between lichens in Northern California and lichens in the Cascade Range hold equally for the redwood forests? I guess, are they similar in both redwood forests? Maybe that's what the question is.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the, so it's interesting in redwood forest because when you're walking around on the ground, you don't see a lot of lichens. Like redwoods don't really have many lichens on the boles of the trees. But in redwoods, all the lichen diversity is in the canopy. So what you have to do is go there in the winter when the winter storms are knocking branches down and look at the litter fall to see what lichens are there. But yeah, the redwood forests share a good number of lichens with conifer forests in the Pacific Northwest. So I'd say there's at least a reasonable amount of overlap. I think if we wanted to apply our index in California, we might go through it again and make some edits. But I would say you could probably apply it as is and still get reasonably meaningful results.
And one more from the chat line, if you don't mind. What about,
yeah, of course.
What about habitat restoration, such as the oak woodlands in Golden Gate Park? Could a survey be helpful guiding planting or maintenance decisions?
I would say, yeah, absolutely. You know, when it comes to lichens, we're often looking to maintain and restore, the substrate really matters for lichens. So we want to be, maintaining the old trees and helping maintain conditions where lichens can grow. But sometimes that involves doing things like thinning out, really dense stands of trees. In Golden Gate Park specifically, we're dealing with some degree of urban air pollution, which limits the lichen communities, which is something that would have to be taken into account. But that said, in San Francisco, we have better air quality than most large cities because we just have this, constant wave of fresh air rolling in from the coast. So yeah, I would love to see more lichen surveys. I live close to Golden Gate Park and walk there a lot, and I've always thought it'd be interesting to do more detailed surveys there. And applying that to management and restoration seems like a laudable goal.
Great answer. Just one more question, if you don't mind. Does the diversity decrease with climax forest?
Diversity of lichens. I assume that means?
Yes, I'm presuming that's the question.
Yeah, great question. So we actually, we looked at species richness. I didn't put that plot in the presentation just to keep things simple. But yeah, species richness actually had a hump-shaped relationship with forest age. So we saw the highest diversity in terms of the number of species was in plots that were maybe stands that were like 150 to 200 years old. And so richness actually decreased a little bit as you got into the older stands, even though, some of these old growth specialist species continued to increase. I think because you lose some of the early successional species, some of the weedier species as you move into the old growth stands.
Very cool. That's it for now. Thanks, Jesse.
All right. Yeah, we'll go ahead and move along and have more time for questions later. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of a related but different topic, which is shifting fire regimes. And of course, everyone in California is aware of this, I think, because we know that the size of wildfires has increased, in our state. We've also seen an increase in fire severity in recent decades, and in some ecosystems at least, and in other ecosystems, we've seen an increase in fire frequency. But understanding how these shifts in fire regimes are affecting biodiversity is a question that certainly is incompletely answered at this point. And particularly for cryptic organisms like lichens, there just hasn't been a lot of research. Studies from other ecosystems are not super common, and they typically have small sample sizes, but there's been some research out there suggesting that lichens can recolonize relatively quickly after fire. But one important question that I've been curious about is whether this is true in an era of larger, sometimes hotter, sometimes more frequent fires, or are these altered fire regimes going to make it harder for lichens to continue to exist where they have in the past? And so this is something I've been focusing on in my own research over the last few years. So a couple more specific questions I've asked are, How long does it take for lichen communities to reestablish after fire? And how does fire severity affect lichen diversity? Do we get different effects from ground fires compared to canopy fires, for example? So I have 2 case studies I want to talk about tonight. I'm not sure if I'll get to both of them. We can see how things are going depending on time. I don't want to keep everyone too long. But the first study is a study of post-fire recolonisation of lichens in Napa County. And this is a project I've worked on with Ali Weil and John Villela. And if we have time, I'll also talk briefly about some research I did in the Sierra Nevada in conifer forests, looking at lichen responses to increased fire severity. So I'll start with the chaparral study. So I'm sure most people here are familiar with chaparral, but for anyone who's not, chaparral ecosystems are California's iconic shrublands. And this is a great quote that Ali found that I now put in every presentation on chaparral. It's kind of like a desert and a temperate forest had a baby, according to a random high school student on YouTube. And chaparral fire regimes are fairly distinctive compared to other ecosystems in California. They're ignition limited, which means that chaparral can usually burn anytime there's an ignition source. And the main thing that's keeping it from burning is just that there's nothing lighting it on fire. And this is in contrast to other fire regimes that we think of as fuel limited. But when chaparral burns, it usually burns hot, and it usually burns all the shrubs to the ground. Or perhaps not all the way to the ground, but at least kills back all the living parts of the shrubs to just wood. And the main concern with altered fire regimes in chaparral is that the fire frequency has increased in recent decades. So we're getting ecosystems that we think used to just burn occasionally are burning on a more frequent basis. And this has raised kind of a debate among ecologists about whether what we call, sometimes is referred to as old growth chaparral, is really a valid ecological concept. So some ecologists have suggested that there's real value to these stands of chaparral that are perhaps 100 years old or even older that haven't burned. But we don't always get very high vascular plant diversity in chaparral, particularly in chamise chaparral, which is the kind of chaparral I'm talking about in this study that I'm just leading into. We often don't see a lot of vascular plants, but we do see a lot of lichens in these old growth chaparral stands. And this photo really illustrates how these old growth chamise plants can just be dripping with lichens, so much that you can barely see the bark sometimes. But this debate of whether old growth chaparral really has a lot of ecological meaning lives on today with no solid resolutions. So with Ali and John, I was interested in trying to address this question using lichens. And one reason why chaparral is important from a lichen perspective is, in addition to just having a lot of lichen biomass, at least at favorable sites, there are also a lot of chaparral lichens of conservation concern. And I've just listed a few of these species here. So, there's concern that if these species are dependent upon old growth chaparral, if we have enough fires, we could lose these species from the landscape. So in this study, we asked how fast lichens establish after fire in chaparral. And we also had help from a few other friends going out and sampling lichen communities. And we did this study near Lake Berryessa in the far eastern corner of Napa County. So just up the hill from Winters, California. And this was a really cool site that was, basically perfect for this study, because there just happened to be areas that had burned at different times that were kind of evenly spaced out. So some areas had burned very recently, other areas had burned long ago, and then there were other areas that had not burned at all, at least in the time that written records have been kept, which we assume is over 100 years. So we went out and we sampled some lichen communities in all of these sites with different fire histories. And what we found was that, as you might expect, lichen diversity increased with time since fire. So in this graph, we have time since fire on the x-axis, and the number of lichen species in a study plot on the y-axis. So you can see that, lichen diversity increases really dramatically in the first few decades after fire, and then it starts to level off, but it still increases a little bit as time goes on after fire. So this suggests that, you at least need a few decades to get all the lichens back, maybe somewhere between 20 and 30 years. But we actually came to believe, after looking at the data more closely, that there is something really special about the lichen communities in these long unburned patches of chaparral. And I'll just give you a little tour of what it looked like out there. So this is a chaparral stand 3 years after fire. You can see the chamise plants have resprouted, but they're just, knee height or even smaller now. So it looks almost like a grassland at this point. 13 years after fire, they're getting bigger. They're like waist height or a little higher. This is John standing there. So keep this photo in mind in a couple more photos, because John is a standard unit of reference. This was a stand 65 years after fire, so the shrubs are quite large. I'd say these ones are maybe like up to my shoulders. I'm a relatively tall guy, so if John was there, we'd maybe just be seeing like the upper half of his head or something. But then when we get into the old growth chaparral, the stuff that hasn't burned for over 100 years, this stuff was well over our heads. I mean, these are old chaparral shrublands. And what we found was there were certain lichen species that were in the old growth 100-year-plus chaparral that we didn't find anywhere else in the study. Even though lichen richness wasn't that much higher than the 65-year-old stands, the cyanolichens, like the Kalima that's pictured in the inset here, that didn't occur anywhere else. So we came to believe that these old growth chaparral stands really do have some potential ecological value for biodiversity. So species richness recovers relatively recently, and relatively rapidly in just a few decades, but some of these slow growing species may not return for quite some time after fire. And the best example was the cyanolichens, which are lichens that have a cyanobacterial partner instead of a green algal partner, were only found in the unburned plots. And these are often lichens that we think of as species of conservation concern or old growth indicators. So the conclusion in my mind is that there may really be some ecological value to this concept of old growth chaparral. It's hard to prevent chaparral from burning because, once it ignites, it's hard to put out, especially during the dry season. But I think this suggests to me that management to limit fire frequency in chaparral could ultimately benefit lichen diversity if we're able to do it successfully. But on the flip side, we often see a lot of managers go out and mow down large areas of chaparral to try to make fire breaks. And this also poses a major threat to chaparral. It doesn't matter if it's a fire that takes it out or if it's, mechanical tools that take it out. If we lose the old growth chaparral, the lichens are gone. So, it's kind of a difficult situation. It's hard to prevent these fires from happening in chaparral. Ultimately, we certainly can't completely control fires out there, but I do think there is unique value to these old growth stands of chaparral where the chamise plants are towering over your head. And I think one reason for that is you get different microclimates in the really large chaparral patches. You have dense shade underneath the chaparral canopy, and you have a cooler, wetter microclimate where these lichens can establish. On the bases of these chaparral plants was often where we would find them. And it seems like in the younger chaparral stands, they're just getting baked in the sun and you don't have those cool, wet microclimates. So that's my interpretation of what we found. So that's my first fire ecology study. I can go on and speak briefly about the second one if we have time, but do we have any questions? Should we pause for questions there?
There are a couple good questions. What are your thoughts about pygmy forest, lichen diversity, and fire risk?
That's a good question. I think the pygmy forests are very cool. I've just visited them very briefly. Those are forests, my understanding is they're forests where plant productivity is limited by something related to soil characteristics. Yeah, I don't think I have anything too profound to say about fire risk. I don't think I know enough about them. I have seen pretty cool, diverse lichen communities in pygmy forests. I think those open habitats where you don't have such a dense canopy overhead can actually lead to greater lichen diversity in some cases. So you might actually have more lichen diversity in pygmy forests than some of the surrounding forests.
Very cool. And then another question is, have humans artificially created old growth chaparral with fire suppression?
Yeah, great question. That's a really interesting question. My first answer would probably be no, because in general, chaparral, well, the historic fire return intervals in chaparral are debated. You know, when it comes to forests, it's easier to do tree ring studies because we have very long-lived trees. You know, we can find trees that are 1,000 years old or more and see how often those trees experience low-severity fires. When it comes to chaparral, it's just much more difficult to recreate the historical or reconstruct the historical fire return intervals. So there is some debate. Some ecologists think chaparral burned very rarely. Others say maybe it was more kind of intermediate. You know, some would say it was like less than once every 100 years. Others might say it was as often as every 40 years. But my feeling is we know that, you know, a lot of chaparral burns much more frequently than it used to. Like in SoCal, we have places where the fire return interval has gotten down to 5 or 10 years. I think few people would argue that that's within the historical range of variation. So I would say, yeah, maybe here and there we've created artificial. I mean, obviously, what's artificial? All of California was managed by humans before Euro-Americans got here. So yeah, maybe we've prolonged it here and there, but I would say overall, chaparral's burning a lot more than it used to.
Fun thoughts. A couple more questions, if you don't mind. Always thought of lichens as growing on dead or dying limbs of trees. Is that wrong?
Short answer, yeah. I mean, they'll grow on dead or dying limbs, but there is some evidence that lichens can harm trees, but they're not parasitizing trees, which is something people often think incorrectly. I think lichens, for one thing, are just more noticeable on dead and dying limbs because there aren't any leaves to get in the way, so you just see the lichens more. But also, you know, if a tree has leaves that are shading out the lichens have to photosynthesize. So yeah, maybe they're not as abundant if there are leaves that are blocking the light. So I guess what I'm really saying is it's not correct to think that the lichens are killing the trees. Most of the time in the big picture is my understanding.
Very cool. So do the symbionts in lichen communities require each other for growth, or can they form these communities in situ?
They don't, well, the algae can grow. My understanding is the algae can grow in a free living form pretty well. The fungi, the fungal partners in the lichens probably can't really survive in any substantial way without the algae. So they really are like uniquely evolved for symbiosis.
Nice. So do lichens provide any benefits to chaparral species that are measurable?
Great question. Well, I mean, we know a lot of animals use the lichens in chaparral communities. So, you know, there's certainly the benefit on that side. When it comes to benefiting the plants, maybe not quite as directly, but there are a couple examples I can think of. We know that some lichens, the cyanolichens, the ones that we only found in the old growth chaparral, are nitrogen fixers. So they provide a source of nutrients that plants can use. And then we also sometimes talk about lichens using the term hydrobuffers. So the idea is when it's wet out, lichens absorb moisture and then they gradually release it when things become drier. So they kind of modulate these swings from really dry to really humid conditions. And of course, a lot of these chaparral patches are kind of at the edge of the coastal fog zone, where you go back and forth between dry and foggy conditions. So they may help kind of maintain stability when it comes to water balance in these ecosystems.
And one more, if you don't mind. Do rare substrates like serpentine support unique and rare lichens?
Yeah. There are known to be like 2 lichens that are serpentine endemics. So it's nothing like the plants in California where we have hundreds of serpentine endemics. You know, serpentine's really toxic, and lichens are much more sensitive to toxins than plants are. You know, we don't have all these lichens that have developed specialized mechanisms for dealing with the heavy metals in serpentine like plants have. But yeah, there's to a small extent, there's a unique community of serpentine lichens.
What about the yeast component? A third partner?
Yeah, that's something I talked about more a couple weeks ago when I was doing my talk for the Santa Clara Valley chapter. Yeah, you know, the yeast is a recent discovery. We know it's around, at least in some lichens, some places. Some people have hypothesized it may have helped lead to the dimension of three-dimensional form in lichens. But there are more questions than answers at this point about what the yeast is actually doing, you know, what its role is. So yeah, I'd say like check back in 10 years and maybe we'll be able to give you a better answer.
Thanks, Jesse. That's all we've got for now. Those are great questions. So,
All right, so I've already been going for what, has it been a whole hour yet, it looks like?
just at an hour.
So I'm wondering, I mean, the last thing I was going to talk about is my conifer forest study. I can go through that briefly if you want, or I mean, maybe this is enough. What do you think, moderator? Should we just cut it off now?
I'm totally loving this myself, but you know, I mean, people are hanging in too. I'll say that.
Well, it's a low pressure situation because people just have to push one button if they want to leave. So
right.
it's not like we're trapping everyone in the auditorium for.
Well, the crowd is weighing in, and it's positive. Everyone says, "Keep going."
Keep going. All right. Well, you know, it's hard to get me to stop talking about lichens once I get going. So, yeah, this won't be too much more, but just one more study here from the Sierra Nevada. And this was a study where we looked at the effects of wildfire on lichens across, this time across several different wildfires over a larger geographic area. So this study took place in a forested ecosystem, specifically in what we call mixed conifer forests and yellow pine forests in California. And these are ecosystems. These are some of the like low to mid elevation conifer forests of California. So in contrast to the higher elevation red fir and subalpine forests, which have somewhat different historical fire regimes. But these lower elevation conifer forests historically burned primarily at low severity. So they had a lot of ground fires that didn't kill the trees. And in part because people suppressed fire in these forests for a century or more, a lot of fuel built up, and that led to an increase in high severity fire. So in recent decades, when these low elevation conifer forests burn, they tend to burn at higher severity, and we get more stand replacing fire. And so what we end up seeing after these fires sometimes is landscapes like this. This is the Angora fire. It burned in 2007 near South Lake Tahoe. You're kind of looking out at Myers in this photo for anyone who's familiar with the area. And you can see that in the foreground, you know, pretty much every single tree was killed over an area of about 1,000 acres. So, you know, that's really a pretty stark contrast to what we think used to happen with fire in these ecosystems. And I took this photo 9 years after the fire, and you can see that there's, you know, no visible tree regeneration. partly because the seeds just aren't able to get into the core area of the fire. They just don't have a way to disperse in there. So it's really a dramatic change to the landscape with these kinds of high severity fires that we think weren't very common in these areas historically. So in this study, I went out and sampled lichen communities in 5 different fires that burned between 2001 and 2013. And we did this sampling, I believe, in 2016 and 2017. So what we did was we tried to sample different parts of the fire across the full gradient of fire severity. So we sampled areas that burned at low severity, which is blue on this map, all the way to areas that burned at high severity, which is red on this map. And then we also did some plots outside of the fire perimeter to try to get a sense of what the forest might have been like, you know, before it burned. And so the protocol was really simple. We did these standard Forest Service plots, similar to those FIA plots I talked about earlier. It's basically just a big imaginary circle, and we would walk around and try to identify all the lichens we could find within a study plot. This is a beautiful red fir forest in Yosemite. And so what we found, one interesting result, so this is fire severity on the x-axis, and this is the number of lichen species we found in a plot on the y-axis. So interestingly, areas that burned at low severity, which is, you know, basically just ground fires, didn't affect the lichen communities at all, probably because a lot of the lichen diversity is up in the forest canopy. And so, you know, the fire is just not reaching the upper canopy with the ground fires. But in areas that burned at high severity, almost all the lichens were eliminated. And even though there were typically still some trees or at least some snags left in these plots, there were very few lichens in the areas that burned at high severity. So almost all the lichens had been eliminated. So the conclusion here is that high severity fire may drastically reduce lichens diversity, potentially for decades, because even in the fire we sampled 16 years after the fire, the lichens had not returned basically at all. One reason for this may be because it's just so much warmer and drier in the environment once you remove the forest canopy. And it could be that what we're seeing is a synergy with climate change. You know, the climate has gotten warmer and drier. Then you take away that protective forest canopy and it's just too hot and dry for these lichens that used to live in these forests to reestablish. So that was my interpretation. So I know this seems like a grim story, but there is a silver lining. The good news here is because the low severity fire didn't really affect the lichens, it suggests that lichens are likely resilient to management practices like prescribed fire, which, you know, prescribed fires are generally low severity ground fires. So it suggests we can go in and, you know, do these controlled burns in these stands without negatively affecting the lichens, which is actually really good news because these prescribed fires are critical management tools. Same is probably true for thinning. We found that that forest canopy cover was positively associated with lichen diversity only up to a point. Once you get to like 40 or 50% canopy cover, having greater canopy cover than that doesn't benefit lichen diversity. And it just so happens that when the Forest Service thins these stands, they aim to thin to about 40 or 50% cover. So the good news is the management we're doing to try to restore these forests is probably at least not causing any harm to lichens and probably benefiting them. And we know this kind of management, the prescribed fire, the thinning, reduces the occurrence of high severity fire. And also hearkening back to the first thing I talked about tonight, thinning these dense stands can also help restore what we might call old growth character. So if you thin a stand, the trees grow faster, you get bigger trees, you get more of these old growth conditions that we know promote lichen diversity as compared to just leaving these dense dog hair thickets that are basically a result of historical logging, which often have very low lichen diversity. So, you know, tonight I have good news and bad news. You know, we're living in challenging times, as we all know. But there's a lot of potential for ways we can potentially manage and restore degraded ecosystems and maintain lichen diversity. the wonderful and incredible lichen diversity of California and the Bay Area, even more specifically. So anyway, that's all I have. I'd be happy to take any further questions. And also, I'd just like to say, feel free to get in touch if you want to correspond further. During, when there are not pandemics going on, I typically, I like to lead lichen walks and lichen workshops a few times a year. So if you send me an email, I can add you to my mailing list. And whenever we're able to do that kind of stuff again, I can let you know. But I always love getting out in the field with people and looking at lichens. So yeah, I hope to hear from some of you in the future. So thanks everyone, and thanks for having me. It was great to be here tonight.
Jesse, that was just fun and fascinating. And our field trip coordinator's ears perked up on that one.
All right, sounds good.
Good to hear from Noreen.
Yeah, well, he did lead a really great lichen walk for us at the top of San Bruno Mountain, I think in January.
Yeah, that was fun.
There are a few questions in the chat and the Q&A, if you wouldn't mind if we could press on you just a little bit more.
Yeah, let's do it.
From Wade, tree holes, often in tan oak and mixed woods, are becoming an interesting forest microhabitat. In some part, tree holes, yeah.
Okay.
And in some part because of the aggressive springtime mosquitoes that breed in them. I'm wondering if lichens find their way into these, and I've never heard of this word before, dendrotomata, and if they could have a role.
That's a really interesting question. I was not aware of tree holes per se. In my field experience, the tan oak I've been around has been kind of like young tan oak in beat up kind of over logged stands in the Klamaths. But when I hear this question, I'm picturing maybe like bigger, more robust tan oaks. So yeah, I haven't seen a lot of like really large old tan oaks in my time in the field, and I'm not sure to what extent they're out there. My feeling is the young tan oaks don't support much for lichen diversity at all, just in general. But yeah, if you get an older tan oak with a tree hole, I'd be curious to go see what's in there.
Yeah. And then from Maya, would you say that lichens are more resilient than other organisms?
In some ways, I mean, as a whole, perhaps yes, because, you can find lichens in almost any terrestrial environment, from the wettest rainforest to the driest deserts. And even places where plants can barely survive, you sometimes get lichens. But then, some lichen species are very sensitive and are kind of fickle and need specific conditions. So as a whole, yeah, as individual species, maybe not so much.
And from Mary, do grasslands have lichen communities?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, absolutely. But they're kind of hard to see. So really productive grasslands, not so much typically. But dry grasslands, where you have kind of like bare ground between the vascular plants, is where you get biological soil crust communities, which contain a lot of lichen diversity. So anywhere where you're like in sagebrush steppe grasslands, with blue bunch wheatgrass, there's the potential for really nice soil crust lichen communities there, which are hard to see, but with practice you can learn to see them and appreciate their beauty and diversity.
Far out. So, and we're getting a little late here, so I think we'll probably call that a wrap.
All right. Well, thanks for all the great questions, everyone. That was fun. Yeah,
it was. And I would like to make one quick brief announcement about our next speaker program to the folks that are still on. On July 2nd, we're going to have Rob Badger and Nita Winter present Beauty and the Beast, a 27-year wildflower journey. California wildflowers and climate change will be their presentation, and I hope that many of you can join us for that. Jesse, thanks again, man, and we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully out in the field quite soon.
Yeah, sounds good. And if I didn't get to anyone's questions, feel free to drop me an email, and I'm happy to try to answer them.
Great. We've got, we'll take a little, we can copy the text from the chat box here. And,
All right.
but I think we covered the most of them.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And thanks for coming, everyone.
It's so fun. Thanks, man.
All right. Bye.
Okay.